This is Charlie Potter, senior team writer with BamaOnLine.com. And we're here, Alabama Tennessee weeks, third Saturday in October coming up. This one it has some juice now. After what happened a couple years in Knoxville, guys, it's back to being an interesting game. I know leading up to this game in the past, we've done a lot of stories on, what guys think about smoking cigars and things like that, because it almost felt like a foregone conclusion that Alabama was just going to beat Tennessee every year, and they did for 15 straight under Nick Saban. But now I think this one's really interesting. I'm really eager to see what you guys have to say about it. But before we kind of get into it, we're going to talk a little bit about the South Carolina game, give our final thoughts there. But we've talked about it a good bit in the media room this week, just kind of around the facility. Just ranking Alabama's rivals. I'll turn it over to you first, Jimmy. Just in terms of maybe a top three, how would you rank Alabama's top rivals?
Well, for me, it would be Auburn 1 and Tennessee 2 and LSU 3. I mean, and that's might even be the conventional answer. I would just remind people that, those are the rivals, but Alabama doesn't really recruit against those three exclusively, or more importantly, I think for Alabama to achieve its goals nationally, you got to beat Georgia for players. You got to beat Texas for players. So I'm such a recruiting and Jimmy's and Joe's guy that, in my twisted head, it's really Georgia and Ohio State and whoever's recruiting great, because that's who you got to beat for players. But hey, with the fans and the games, it's Auburn, Tennessee, and LSU in that order for me.
I think that's a good point. And I think from an on-the-field standpoint, I agree with you. I think I almost have Georgia and LSU tied a little bit, because I think now that Coach Saban retired, that element of that rivalry game is gone. You also add in the Kirby Smart at Georgia aspect. I mean, we talked extensively here on the site, the message board, about that Alabama-Georgia game a couple weeks ago, and just that environment. I think that's why it's tough for me to pick between Georgia and LSU right now. The last decade, I would easily say LSU, but I think Auburn, Tennessee in that 1-2 spot, and then kind of a coin flip at 3. What about you, Blake?
Auburn's 1 for sure. I mean, it doesn't get much better than the Iron Bowl in college football as far as rivalries go. But really, for me, that 2 spot, I'll say Tennessee. But for a long time, just for me growing up, it was LSU. Because, the first time I can truly remember Alabama losing to Tennessee was that 2022 game. So for the longest, I knew that it was supposed to be a rivalry. I knew that they were historical rivals, but I had never really seen that play out on the field in a more fierce way until really Josh Heupel got to Tennessee and they got more competitive. So really that LSU game was my most anticipated game on the schedule every year, whenever they had Les Miles, and then whenever they had a couple of those really good teams with that Orgeron. Like, that was the game with how many NFL players were on the field and everything like that. But of course, you take the historical aspect of it, and also the fact that Tennessee has gotten good again and kind of rejuvenated the rivalry, so to speak. That's got to be your number 2. I've met a lot of older Alabama fans that some of them put Tennessee over Auburn as their number 1 rival. I don't think that's the case. I think the in-state aspect will always make it to where the Iron Bowl, Alabama and Auburn, is the number 1 rivalry, and that's the same across all sports. But there are a lot of Alabama fans out there that hate Tennessee a little more than they do Auburn. So I think that makes this week pretty interesting, and it's always fun when these two teams meet with the historical significance of the rivalry.
Yeah, how's the saying go? You have to hate Auburn, but you choose to hate Tennessee. I think that's the way a lot of people view it. So I think with this rivalry being what it is now, kind of back and forth, really, and what should be a close game on Saturday, I think it's great for college football. And before we really turn our full attention to this year's game, just kind of want to share final thoughts on the South Carolina game. Another close one for Alabama. It was ugly at times, especially in the first half, start of the second, and the end of the game. But Jimmy, I know we haven't talked, at least in this setting, since. Just what are your final thoughts as we kind of shift the page to Tennessee?
I've participated in some of the negativity, no doubt, in sharing opinions about how Alabama played on Saturday. But I want to focus really on the positives. And it is a win over an SEC opponent that's a pretty good football team that has a handful of dudes that would be dudes for anyone. Their defensive line is absolutely legit. Tennessee's is really good, and I'm not sure they're much better than South Carolina's. I mean, Georgia's defensive line is good, but South Carolina's got some good defensive linemen. They have an athletic quarterback that reminds me a lot of a younger Jalen Milroe. He's going to get better and better as he plays. They got a high quality big back. I mean, that's a good team. It was an SEC win. And during stretches of the game, Alabama played really well on both sides of the ball. They didn't give up a third down conversion in the entire first half. Offensively, they did drive the field and score, even going up against a quality defense. They scored just as many points on offense as the vaunted Lane Kiffin offense did, for Ole Miss. So I think there really were some positives, and a lot of, I would be more concerned, guys, if I felt South Carolina lined up and just whipped Alabama. I really think a lot of South Carolina's success in the game was directly due to Alabama mistakes, and mistakes can be corrected. What can't be corrected is when you're just physically not as good as your opponent. You can't correct that, but you can correct errors. And there were a lot of errors that led that game to be closer than maybe it should have.
No doubt. I think they got off to a much better start. I mean, obviously falling into a 13-0 hole at Vanderbilt's not ideal, but to jump out 14-0, to score on your first drive, to get off the field on your first drive as a defense, I think was encouraging. But you're right, Jimmy. Just some uncharacteristic mistakes, especially from Jalen Milroe, with some of the things that he did from a turnover standpoint. I thought the defense, while it wasn't a great game, I thought they played better this week. Like you said, they were able to get off the field more. The Damani Jackson pick at the end was big, even though that was kind of just an arm punt from Lenore Sellers. But a step in the right direction, but still plenty to clean up. Blake, what was your kind of assessment of the way that game ended? I know you were still up in the press box there at the end, but how it ended and how Alabama can kind of move on from here.
I mean, I think it's pretty undeniable that Alabama played better against South Carolina than they did against Vanderbilt. And like you said, Jimmy, I really agree that there were a lot of phases in the game that Alabama looked better than they did the week before, particularly on the defensive side. But again, it's those small mistakes that add up. And really, it doesn't matter if you outplay your opponent, if you make enough little mistakes that end up losing you the football game, especially when those little mistakes cost you a couple points here and there. And you look at two back-to-back at the end of the first half by Jalen Milroe with the safety that gave up 2 points and then immediately the interception that set up South Carolina for a field goal. That's 5 points in 2 plays that they don't really show up when you're looking at box scores and you're looking at who outgained who and you're looking at third down conversion rate and all those things. Like little mistakes like that give the other team points are important. And then you also look at the opening drive for South Carolina out of the half. Like you said, Charlie, they didn't give up a third down conversion in the first half. And then South Carolina gets the ball and goes on one of those super long 7-8 minute drives for 15, 16 plays, convert 5 third downs. And in the grand scheme of the whole game, it's just one drive, but that's almost that drive itself lost Alabama the lead and was almost a really big mistake that ended up costing them the game. And then you also look at the fourth down touchdown that South Carolina scored in the first half. That was with Damani Jackson out of the game, and you were even deeper on the bench. You had Zay Mincy in at quarterback, and he had, whether it was a mistake or whatever it was, like it was his guy that gave up the touchdown. Maybe it was a good play, a good scheme by South Carolina, but regardless, that's another mistake that costs you points. And so I feel like Alabama outplayed South Carolina for the large majority of the game, but it was way closer than it maybe should have been because of those small things. But the good news is, like you said, Jimmy, that they corrected it. The good news is in the fourth quarter, I thought Alabama played pretty well up until, the onside kick mistake. And just like you look at different aspects of this game and you're like, well, they really excelled in this area. And then they turned right around and made a dumb mistake that made it closer than it should have been. And that kind of happened over and over again, especially whenever you jumped out to a 14-0 lead. So it was a step in the right direction to see them, one, win the game, and two, that they played better for the most part on the defensive side, but you got to cut down on some of those mistakes. But really, whenever you look at it, if they were able to make that many mistakes and still win, they were doing enough things right, and that's enough that you can build on going forward. So against Tennessee, you've got to see less of those mistakes that just feel really stupid and just give up random points to the other team. That if you eliminate those, it makes the margin a lot different by the end of the game.
I think with this game too, we're going to kind of shift gears to this week's game. is Tennessee's in a very similar boat to Alabama. They had a loss to an Arkansas team that's not at the top of the league. They're not going to be competing for a spot in Atlanta. They had a rough go against a Florida team that's kind of in the same boat as Arkansas. So these two teams are kind of they're almost mirror images going into this third Saturday in October. Tennessee's 5-1 with a 2-1 record in the league. They have a wins over Florida, Oklahoma, the loss to Arkansas, and you kind of look at them. They're really good on the ground. Dylan Sampson's a great running back. Nico Iamaleava has been good at quarterback. His numbers aren't just jumping off the page here of late, especially in SEC play, but they've got one of the best ground games in the country. They lead the SEC. I think Sampson has 15 touchdowns. And then on the defensive side of the ball, kind of where we're going to start here is they're really good up front, like Jimmy kind of alluded to a little bit ago. So when you look at this game, Jimmy, maybe not so much from a Tennessee standpoint, but from a Jalen Milroe standpoint, it's really going to be the first true road game of the season. I know they've played at Wisconsin. I know they played at Vanderbilt, but that crowd at Wisconsin was gone at the end of the third quarter. As much as they want to kind of poke and prod at Nick Saban about his comments, they weren't untrue about the Vanderbilt crowd. It was very Crimson heavy. So what do you think against this Tennessee defense and going into what's going to be a hostile environment, Jalen Milroe needs to do on Saturday afternoon?
Yeah, he needs to play a little better than he did against South Carolina. I don't think that was one of his better games. We now have such a large body of work, a full season and a half of Milroe starting games. I think now you can sort of rank them based on, when he's been really good or maybe not so good. And there were just a couple of too many errors. He's still the same playmaker he's always been. So really it's just dialing back the errors and just kind of letting the game come to him. But I really think this is a testament to how far the kid has come, because last year in this spot, I think it would be very fair to ask, is Jalen Milroe good enough or ready to win a huge SEC game like this on the road in that environment? And I think now, a year and a half later, we know that he is. I don't think it's a real worry. As a matter of fact, I think Alabama's got a real good shot to win the game because of Jalen Milroe. I mean, he's going to make plays against even elite defenses on the road in hostile environments. What he has to do is not give the game away with turnovers and make good decisions in the RPO game in terms of keeping or pitching, and no turnovers, because Tennessee's too good. Alabama helped South Carolina stay in that game. You can't help. Tennessee doesn't need help. So you turn over the ball against them, you're just going to lose. So play a clean game, make the plays that are there, make good decisions in the RPO game, and Jalen Milroe can get a big win and claw back in this Heisman race that the Boise kid and the Colorado kid seems to be dominating right now.
Yeah, it's not, apples to apples by any means, but it kind of feels like last year's A&M game. Kind of an earlier kick. Not you're not going to be playing under the lights, but it's still just a hostile road crowd, and kind of seeing what Jalen Milroe can do, for lack of a better word, with his back against the wall. And so I think, for 90+% of the time this season, the offense has played well, and that hasn't been a problem. And he's played kind of out of his mind, honestly. But yeah, you're right. I mean, he has to clean up the mistakes, and that's going to be very important on the road because communication is going to be almost non-existent. And so I think going against this Tennessee defense that, has some dudes, I think they're top 4 in the SEC in every major category. When you look at scoring, passing, rushing, they've got some dudes on that side of the ball. So Blake, when you look at them, whether it's from a front seven or back end or all together, just what jumps off the page about this Tennessee defense?
Well, I think one thing you have to look at, and we'll get to it later, is that Tennessee's offense has struggled a lot, but they haven't lost a lot of these games in the SEC when their offense has struggled because of how good this defense is. And they've held every single SEC opponent they've played under 20 points. And that starts with their front seven. It starts with their defensive line, and really with James Pierce, their defensive end up there, who's a first-round NFL draft talent and a guy who Alabama's offensive line is going to have their hands full trying to handle. And we saw really this past weekend that Jalen Milroe and the offense struggled a little bit when it came to protecting him against a stout defensive front that can really test the offensive line with twists and stunts and different things like that kind of confuse them. And so I think protecting him is first and foremost the number one priority. But if they're able to do that, that's going to allow, like, I think Tennessee's secondary and I think their corners can be had. Like, I think there are explosive plays that can be made in this game with Ryan Williams, with Jeremy Bernard down the field. But what that's going to take is protection. And like we saw against South Carolina, Alabama didn't really have the chance to develop any of those kind of longer routes, any of those downfield shots, because it felt like every 1.5, 2 seconds after a drop back, Milroe was getting hit, or he was having to escape, or he was getting brought down. So against this Tennessee defensive front, Alabama is going to have to protect Milroe to kind of work in some of those deep shots. And I think Ryan Williams and Bernard can have success against these corners. But another thing is Alabama is going to have to run the ball well. And we keep saying that. And Kalen DeBoer keeps saying that he wants to see these running backs get the ball more. But, we got to see it actually happen before we believe it. But I think if they want to actually establish the run, like we've suggested more than a few times on this show, and like a lot of fans have suggested, if they're able to run the ball well, that opens up even more. And then to that point, Tennessee's starting linebacker, we learned, is out for the year, their signal caller on the defensive end. And so if anything, that is a boost in Alabama's direction as far as personnel on that Tennessee front seven. So I think really if they can contain James Pierce, and I don't know if you really can do that for a whole game because he's really good. He only has 2 sacks on the season, but don't let those numbers fool you. I think he has 20-something pressures on the year. So it's not just that he's sacking the quarterback, it's that he's getting back there and he's affecting the backfield, wreaking havoc on the plays that way. So protecting Jalen Milroe first and foremost. And if they're able to do that, I think there are some shots that can be taken in this game. And if they're able to convert on explosive plays, I mean, that's the recipe for success with this Alabama offense, especially against this defense. So I think that's kind of what you're looking for, is being able to open it up with some explosives that way.
Not to get repetitive at all, but Jimmy, is there anything about this Tennessee defense that stands out to you more than anything else?
The front. I mean, getting James Pierce blocked. I mean, I think it was more schematic and maybe some errors on Alabama's front and the protections, but they just didn't get Kennard blocked at South Carolina. There were 2 or 3 instances where the kid made a play because Alabama just simply didn't put a body on him at all, which is sort of unfathomable. You can't do that against James Pierce. You're probably going to have to put 2 guys on him. I mean, we just saw it with Kennard. Pierce is the same player. If anything, he's better, which is saying so much. So that's what stands out to me. You look, Kennard almost single-handedly kept South Carolina in the game at times, it felt. Pierce could do the same thing at Tennessee. So just, have a better plan for accounting for the premier pass rusher is what leaps to mind for me.
No doubt. And James Pierce is that dude on defense, but Dylan Sampson's been that dude on offense. And like I said earlier, his numbers are, out the roof. I think he has 15 rushing touchdowns. Nico has 7 passing touchdowns. That kind of tells you how effective he's been from just a point standpoint. So when you watch Sampson, Jimmy, just what jumps off the page and how much of a problem can he be on Saturday?
Just such a typical SEC back. And I mean that as the highest compliment. One of my favorite things I say every April is, and this is what I'm saying because Dylan Sampson immediately comes to mind. I always say the best pick in the NFL draft is an SEC running back on day 3. Might not be the obvious day 1 guy like Najee Harris or even a day 2 guy, a guy that barely misses the first round. But the SEC is just full of quality backs, because if you can make yards in this league, if you can be productive as a running back in this league, then you're probably going to be productive in that next league too. And Dylan Sampson just immediately strikes me as, I don't know that he's going to have the measurables to prove that he should be drafted on a Thursday or a Friday night. But if you take him on Saturday, you're getting a dude. I mean, he's just too productive against good defenses to not be a good player. What's interesting to me about dealing with Sampson for Alabama guys is the last 2 weeks, Alabama has struggled a little bit against the run, but you had to really prepare for QB runs. Mm-hmm. And Nico Iamaleava is a good runner. He is athletic. I'm not selling his athleticism short. I'm just saying Tennessee smartly doesn't allow him to get hit a lot because they need him to throw the ball. Sampson is really the run threat that you defend, not Pavia at Vanderbilt or even Sellers/Ashford at South Carolina. This is interesting because now you got to focus on the other team's run game, but it's the back. It's not the quarterback. And something just kind of feeling, guys, Alabama's going to be more comfortable with that.
No doubt. Yeah, it's a traditional approach. It's something that you see more week in and week out. It's not, an anomaly, so to say. But I think, with Sampson, he's not the biggest back. Christian Robinson today actually talked about him being a little bit small and how he can kind of hide behind the offensive line and be patient. And that's a dangerous combination because, once he slips out, if you get him and try to sling him down, he's a slippery guy. He can keep on his feet and keep going. So, I think that I don't know if it's the number one key to the game, but if you can keep Dylan Sampson in check, it's going to probably fare pretty well for this Alabama defense. And we talked a lot about Nico, and I think he's a hell of a quarterback. I think he can throw it a country mile. Malachi Moore mentioned that when we were talking to him on Tuesday. But when you watch Nico, Blake, what stands out, and what do you think this Alabama defense can do from a back end standpoint? Because it's had some coverage busts here of late.
Yeah, I think he's a really interesting case when you look at how his season has gone because he looks like a pro quarterback. I mean, he's 6'6", he's got the height, he's got the build, he's got the throwing motion, he's got the arm. Like he looks like a guy who's going to play on Sundays, and he very well might. But this season has been interesting because he had a really strong start. He threw for like 300 in the opener against I don't even know who it was, Chattanooga, and then he threw for 200 against NC State, a ranked NC State, but an NC State team that's really not as good as we all thought they were going to be at the start of the season. And he hasn't thrown for 200 yards again in a game since that NC State game. He also is only completing about 65% of his passes on the season, which you expect from a guy like him to be closer to the 70s, maybe in the mid 70s. And then on top of that, he hasn't thrown a touchdown pass by the time this game comes around on October 19th. He hasn't thrown a touchdown pass since September 21st. So it's almost been a month since he's thrown a touchdown pass in a game, which is really surprising because he's one of one of the more hyped up quarterbacks in the SEC. And I think a lot of that comes down to how other teams have defended him and how whenever their offense kind of gets out of rhythm, it's really hard for him to operate. And so against Arkansas, against Florida, really whenever teams are able to get pressure, I think the key for Alabama is getting pressure because we saw it with Carson Beck in the first half in the Georgia game. Nico has a little bit of running ability, but he's not Lenore Sellers. He's not going to be able to run to that extent. So whenever you make him uncomfortable and you're able to put a little pressure on him, I think that's what gets Tennessee's offense a little out of rhythm. And I think that's whenever he starts to struggle. I just can't get over the fact that he has 0 touchdowns and 1 interception in his last 2 games. Like a quarterback of that caliber that's that highly regarded being that bad, so to speak, against SEC competition, even though they're lower tier SEC teams. It's just interesting to me. And I think that you have to expect that this Tennessee offense is going to come together eventually this season. But you just have to see Alabama get pressure. And if they don't, this could be the game where Tennessee gets back on track because Alabama's defense hasn't been particularly great, especially defending third down. We've talked about that plenty. But when it comes to defending Nico, making him uncomfortable is number one. But again, you're playing in Neyland Stadium. So he's going to be in a home environment. He's going to be in a stadium where the crowd's behind him, 100,000 strong. So if Alabama can make him uncomfortable early, that's what you want to see, because if he gets into rhythm and that offense starts clicking, they might not be looking back anytime soon.
I think his number is a little surprising given the offense he's in and what we've seen from Josh Heupel and these quarterbacks in the past. But again, if you keep Dylan Sampson in check, I think that's a huge check in terms of the list of what you need to do to win this game. But I think the battle between Nico and maybe even the secondary, I agree with you that Alabama needs to get pressure on him, no doubt. But I think the way that the secondary has given up some plays here of late, some busts on third and long or fourth down is a little worrisome. I think whoever comes out on top of this might decide the winner, honestly. Jimmy, before we kind of switch gears a little bit, what do you think of the way that Alabama's played on the back end defensively here of late?
Hit or miss. I mean, the bust that allowed the touchdown, South Carolina, the bust, which I think was a safety issue, that was a little alarming. I mean, you're going to get beat sometimes in this league. Sometimes you're just going to cover guys and they're good and they're going to beat you, kind of like what happened with Nick Harbor beating Damani on that play. Look, Damani had good coverage. I thought Nick Harbor pushed off a little bit, but Damani was right there. Damani forced a perfect throw and catch. So you can't really fault Damani much. Sometimes the other guy in this league is really good. But what's more alarming to me, guys, is busts. I mean, where you're literally giving plays away because you didn't play it correctly as you were coached. You didn't play it as how they draw it up on the grease board. You made a mental error, as Nick Saban always called them, and gave points away. Hey, you could survive against South Carolina giving points away. You won't survive Tennessee if you give the points away. So, hey, if you get beat by Squirrel White or Brew McCoy or, Dylan Sampson on a wheel route, hey, tip your hat because those are good players. But don't bust. Don't make a mental error that hands them points.
No doubt. I think that's a good point and a good spot to end just in terms of talking about this game. Before we get out of here, we want to talk about some past games because, this is a rivalry that, it goes back a way. And I just want to kind of get your guys' opinion, take a stroll down memory lane. Just what's maybe your favorite third Saturday in October? Blake, since you're the youngster of the group, we'll start with you.
Well, again, I haven't seen all that many. I mean, I really haven't seen a lot of close ones, to be honest with you. I have vague memories of that 2009 game, but they don't really stick out to me because I was really young. I've seen a million replays of the Rocky Block with Terrence Cody, and I'm sure that'll be one of y'all's answers. But really, for me, the 2015 game, I think, was a really good one. And it was one where back at home, Alabama's kind of rolling toward – they've gotten the ball back rolling after losing to Ole Miss early in that season, and they're playing a tough Tennessee team, but one that ultimately I think finished closer to 500 than they would have 10 wins or anything like that. And Alabama was in a dogfight the whole game. And I think Derrick Henry scored a late touchdown to put Alabama ahead. And I think on that drive, Jake Coker had two third and long throws to the sideline, one to Ardarius Stewart, one to Calvin Ridley that had like toe tap catches to set up that touchdown. And then on the next Tennessee possession, you had a Ryan Anderson strip sack and an Ashawn Robinson fumble recovery that kind of sealed the game. So that was a good one. I think the final score was 19-14, so a close game, and really one of the first close Alabama-Tennessee games I can remember, because between 2009 and 2015, I think there were a lot of blowouts in there between these two teams. And so I think going back memory-wise, that one stands out to me.
What about you, Jimmy?
Yeah, 2009 was too long ago for Blake, and this is going to be too long ago for Charlie, I think. But really, and this game might sound like Greek to you guys, but in 1990, when I was actually in school there, Alabama started the season 0-3. Is not a good way to start the Gene Stallings era. They finally got on the winning ledger against Vanderbilt in Game 4. And then went to and then was in Knoxville, I think, at 2-3. I think they beat maybe South, what's now Louisiana Lafayette. So they're 2-3, and Tennessee is unbeaten and in the top 5, and it's in Knoxville. And everyone might recall that morning on game day, which was in its infancy. They weren't even going to campuses yet. It was a studio show back then. But Lee Corso that morning of that game said Alabama has as much chance to win this game as a high school team. And Alabama's defense played out of their minds. It's 6-6 really late in the game. And Tennessee is lining up for the game-winning kick with about 30 seconds left. And Alabama not only blocks the kick, they blocked the kick and the ball rolled back about 30 yards. Yards Alabama's offense never would have made on their own. That the ball just kept rolling after a block kick, landing in a spot where Alabama could try a last-second kick. And Phillip Doyle, I think it was 47 yards as time expired. Phillip Doyle wins the game for Alabama 9-6. And that wasn't a great season for Alabama, but it was an all-time great win. And just total jubilation. And that game really helped kick off the Gene Stallings era. Alabama didn't lose very often after that, all the way through Coach Stallings' retirement in 1996.
I didn't pick the Rocky Block because I figured that would be taken. I went back a little further to 2005, kind of whenever you start really, for me, I wasn't born in 1990. Sorry, Jimmy, but still just a twinkle over here. But 2005 is really when you start paying attention to football. 13 years old, and to see that the hit that Roman Harper had. For the ball to bounce into the end zone for a touchback. And then I think on the next play, Brody Croyle dialed one up deep to DJ Hall, and Alabama won that game 6-3. That's unfathomable today, a 6-3 win. That one just sticks out in my mind, just that play. You see the paintings. It resonates so much. And I honestly thought about an even more recent one than Blake, which is a little shocking, in 2019. We kind of talk about like crowd noise and how that could be a factor. That 2019 game was kind of a dud. Alabama, I think, had a 28-13 lead, but Tennessee was driving. They were at the goal line, and they fumble, and Trayvon Diggs takes it back for a 100-yard fumble return, and that place went nuts. And that was even, we were at the old press box, so it was open. You could hear it. It was insane. And those aren't defining moments, I think, in this rivalry, just in terms of years where Alabama's winning a national championship or things like that. But they're moments that just kind of stick with you, maybe more so than others. And I think there's so many. We could have done an entire show on this, but we'll get ahead out here on this. We got some basketball this week. Not only was there SEC media days in Mountain Brook, but we got charity exhibition on Friday night. I know Blake and I are gonna head up to Birmingham before heading to Tennessee. Alabama's going to take on Wake Forest at Boutwell Auditorium. But before we get to that, Blake, you were in Mountain Brook for the tip-off. Just maybe what was a takeaway or two from your time with Nate Oates and Mark Sears and Latrell Reitzel?
Yeah, one of the biggest things they talked about was something I think a lot of fans are interested in, and that's how are they going to manage the minutes with all of the talent that's on this roster. And really, the answer a lot of them gave was that it doesn't really matter how much you play. It matters what you do when you're in the game. And that was the message that Nate Oates said on the podium. That was the answer that Latrell Reitzel gave when people asked him about it. He said Oates always talks about how you have 4-minute increments that you play in. And if you're not playing hard in those 4-minute increments, you might not get another one, because there's so many guys on this team that are capable of playing that's what it's going to take. And Nate even talked about how there are going to be guys that have to make sacrifices. He said there are going to be guys that played larger roles on last year's team that are going to have to take a little bit of a smaller role this year, because, I mean, you look at this roster, and I know they're dealing with a couple injuries right now, but fully healthy, there are 10, 11, 12, maybe even all 13 guys that could seriously compete for minutes, and on other schools in the SEC would be legitimate contributors. And so just on down the line, there's so many guys. But I think the amount of times that we've heard Nate Oates talk about the character of the guys that they brought in, and also the guys that were on last year's team, it doesn't seem like this group is particularly worried about, I need to score 10 points a game, or I need to go get mine, or whatever. Like, it sounds like these guys were brought here because they want to win. And they know that that's going to take the occasional, maybe I don't play as much this game. And they talked about Mudita again, the word that they used last year, which is vicarious joy through another teammate's success. And that's another theme and kind of motto that they're going to have to embody this year, with so many guys that only so many can play on the floor at one time. And it's going to be interesting to see how those minutes really do end up shaking out. I think there will be a lot of opportunities here early in the season, because you have Chris Youngblood, who's hurt until Nate Oates said sometime in December. So mid-December is whenever they'll start ramping him up for conference play. But with him out, I personally had him as a projected starter entering the season. So that's a lot of minutes up for grabs for some of these younger guards, guys like LeBaron Philon, Aiden Holloway, to show what it is that they have. Even a veteran like Houston Millette, who transferred in. Like, these guys have a chance to show what they have, and that will turn into what minutes they get once conference play rolls around, once March rolls around. And Nate Oates will actually silver lining from the Youngblood injury, get an idea of what he has behind him with some of these guys moved into some larger minutes. And then one other quick takeaway is a couple guys talked about kind of what the expectations are for the season. There's a lot of hype around this season, probably the most anticipated Alabama basketball season ever in their history. And I asked Latrell Wrightsell, or I didn't ask him how they're handling expectations. Somebody else asked him, what are the expectations for this team kind of within the program? And he was simple. He said, we want to win 4 championships. We want to win the Players Era, the SEC regular season, the SEC tournament, the national championship. And so they're very clear about what their goals are. And there's very lofty, very high expectations, but, they have equally high expectations for themselves. And rightfully so. I mean, they're the number 2 team in the preseason top 25, and were picked to win the SEC, and all of those preseason accolades that don't really mean anything, but they go to show that this is a really good team that is set up to have a really good season if things go right.
I'm excited to see them take on another team on Friday night. And, it's going to be interesting because they won't be at full strength. So it's not a complete preview, but I think we'll learn quite a bit. So that'll be exciting for you, Jimmy, when they face Wake Forest on Friday. Kind of what do you want to see, expect to see, just your overall thoughts going into what will be kind of their first game, so to speak?
Well, I hope people don't make too much of a thing. I mean, are the expectations so high that people are going to complain about margin of victory? I mean, as a football thing, I notice fans do that with the softball team, which is just so outrageous. Like they only won 3-2. But I think the only thing that's going to really hurt this team or potentially hurt the team is that the pressure and anxiety of having such lofty goals swallows them up. I mean, that's happened before. These are college-aged kids. Well, not really. Most of them are, because this really is an older team. But I think just handling the pressure, just people need to remember about this Friday night is, I forget, what do they call them on Broadway? The Tony Awards. They don't hand out the Tonys for the dress rehearsal. I mean, no one's ever won a Tony Award for what happened in the dress rehearsal. I mean, they hand out the trophies when starting opening night, when the lights come on and the paying crowd shows up. It is a dress rehearsal, so people shouldn't make too big a deal about it either way.
Didn't see this show ending on a Tony reference, but I like it. I like it. Yeah, I like it a lot.
I'm sure Tim probably talks about it all the time on his.
Actually, don't get him started on musicals because you'll never get him to shut up. With that, I think that deserves a 5-star rating if you haven't already. If you listen to it on podcast, like and subscribe for the reference from Jimmy. Heck, if you haven't signed up for BOL yet, we have a great promo this week. It's $1 for your first. What is it? First week. But then your first year is half off. So it's a little bit complicated, but a hell of a deal. So take advantage of that if you haven't already. But guys, always appreciate it. Looking forward to Friday night, Saturday afternoon. And I know, Jimmy, you'll probably be on the post-game show with Tim and them. Right. And we'll have full coverage from Neyland Stadium. Looking forward to it. And we'll see you guys on the next show.